Hello and welcome to Ellroy Reads. This is the show where we pay tribute to an author who is intelligent, incredibly talented, effortlessly charming, devilishly handsome. And Ellroy's not bad either. Okay, so our book for this week is The Song Is You by Megan Abbott. Okay, so to give you a bit of backstory here, Megan Abbott is one of the leading authors of both crime fiction and also leading literary figures writing today. She was born in Detroit and raised in Grosse Pointe. Her father was a professor of political science at Wayne State. Her mother is also a writer of crime and other genres. And Megan was studied first at the University of Michigan and then did her doctoral studies in New York, where she has taught. And through her studies came her first book, which was a non-fiction book, which was called The Street Was Mine, a study of nostalgic masculinity, hard-boiled. The Street Was Mine, Nostalgic Masculinity in Hard-Boiled Fiction, as I think its full title. Anyway, it's a marvelous, marvelous book. And I read it when I was doing my thesis, and then a few years later, Megan was the guest at Harrogate's Crime Writing Festival, and I was in the audience. And by this stage, she was already a mega novelist and screenwriter. And the person kind of interviewing her on stage listed all of her big sellers, and then she was like, "What's this book? The Street Was Mine? What's this tiny little book that you've written?" And I was like, that book is brilliant. Do not knock academic books. Anyway, The Street Was Mine is a wonderful book. And naturally, when she moved into fiction and into writing novels, her profile began to rise exponentially. And The Song Is You is her second novel. And her first four novels are to me, actually her greatest work. Die Little, The Song Is You, Queen Pin, and Bury Me Deep. They're really marvelous novels, but she hits on a theme that was very important to her as an academic, which was kind of rewriting the female figure in hard-boiled fiction. So the femme fatale, or the heroine, or kind of rewriting these kind of stereotypical tropes, just reimagining them in the same kind of classic noir period of the 40s or 1930s, and the usual classic noir settings like Los Angeles, but making us rethink these figures and making the novel less kind of male centric. So The Song Is You is a second novel, and it is based on a classic classic Hollywood mystery, the disappearance of Jean Spangler. Now, Jean Spangler was a bit part actress. She had roles in a number of studio films in the time, notably Young Man with a Horn with Kirk Douglas. And in 1949, she just disappeared off the face of the earth. She was divorced, she had a daughter, and she said she was going to film that night, but there was no trace of her doing any work. The mystery, gripped Los Angeles at the time and has continued to grip true crime buffs. Her belongings were found, a letter was found addressed to Kirk and talking about how she can't wait any longer, she's going to see a doctor. And Kirk Douglas was the star of Young Man with a Horn, and he actually had a police interview in which he denied ever knowing her, although he admitted later in a public statement that, I was reminded by a friend I did know her, we did a scene together in the film, and I kidded around with her a bit, but I never saw her before or after. So this mystery went to the absolute heart of Hollywood. There were a number of theories going around. She told a friend, the actor Robert Cummings, that she was having a quite steamy affair, and that the novel begins with a conversation between her and Cummings, and he's like, "Is it serious?" And she says, "No, but I'm having the time of my life," and that's actually the dialogue just repeated verbatim, which Cummings, told the police as to when they interviewed him about if he had any knowledge of her whereabouts. So links have been made potentially to an abortion racket because sounded she, friends knew she was pregnant at the time, out of wedlock, which was, controversial or stigmatized at the time in the late 1940s. And also there were supposed links to the Los Angeles gangsters, including Mickey Cohen. But the case has never been solved, which gives Megan Abbott perfect opportunity to, fictionalize the case, but also solve it. So Megan's lead character is Gil Hopkins, and he is a studio fixer, publicist type. And we first see him, it's 1951, so 2 years after Jean has disappeared. And he's at the peak of his powers. His star client is Barbara Payton, who, that's another tragic Hollywood story. Barbara Payton died in the late 1960s at the age of only 39 of heart failure and liver failure after her career had gone well off the rails. She was married 5 times, she had numerous affairs, and she became kind of just like the tabloid's favorite. Tabloid stigmatized her basically, but she had run-ins with the law, and it's a very, very sad story because she didn't get the sort of help that addiction and mental health is available today. But anyway, we see Gil and Barbara when they're both at the peak of their powers. Gil as a fixer and her as a rising star. And it's tinged with tragedy because we know it's not going to turn out well for Barbara. And suddenly an African American actress called Eileen contacts Gil and says, "You remember the Jean Spangler case? Well, you and I were with Jean the night she disappeared. We went to a rather rough club." And at first, Gil doesn't want anything to do with it. It's his job to bury stories, not to solve mysteries. And he thinks he fears that the story, if it was to break again, could get him into a lot of trouble. But gradually, he becomes more and more involved in investigating the case. And not just involved in terms of wanting to find out the truth, but also involved emotionally with Jean Spangler, and in the sense that it's putting his career on the line because he just wants it to go away, but he feels like this could be his redemption. So there's a lot of classic noir tropes here. Now, Megan Abbott and Ellroy, got to know each other very, very well, and I'm kind of reversing the format of the show a little bit because I usually say books that inspired Ellroy. Today I'm reversing that a little bit because Megan described her first 4 novels, the titles I mentioned, as love songs to James Ellroy, and but Ellroy, greatly admired Megan Abbott's novels as well. In fact, there's a blurb on the front of this in which he says, "Megan Abbott, superb storyteller, poised to ascend to the top rung of crime writing, and quite possibly something beyond." And that's exactly what happened in terms of Megan Abbott's novels burst onto the scene, and finally a revisionist take on noir. I mean, everyone's saying that their take on noir is revisionist. 9 times out of 10, it turns out to be just the same old tropes, and you feel you've read this before. But this really felt quite stunningly original when it came out, and still does. And the novel's actually 18 years old now. So, but it still reads very, very fresh, and of course it's quite slim, which I always find is a great thing, especially in noir. There is an urgency. This is a young writer. There's an urgency to tell the story, which is what I really love about young and first-time writers, is that they're just absolutely hungry to tell the story. But Megan Abbott ran a tribute to Ellroy on The Rap Sheet, which is one of the great blogs on crime fiction. Everyone should read it, along with Venetian Vase, which is my blog. And Linda Brown of the Mysterious Bookstore in LA wrote to her and said, "Oh, well, if you really like Ellroy so much, we're doing the LA Times Festival of Books. I can wangle you a seat next to him at the book signings." And they did. And when I interviewed Megan for Love Me First in Danger, my biography of Ellroy, she said, "Oh, I had him trapped. It was like several hours, 4, 5, 6 hours. I can't remember, but we just talked and talked and talked." and we really hit it off. And then we talked about Zodiac, which was the David Fincher film, which was newly released and which we're both obsessed over. And it was the beginning of a really, really charming friendship. In fact, it's one of the few friendships of all the friends of Ellroy I talked to, where she had absolutely nothing bad to say about him. And it's still it was all extremely positive. And what's interesting about this book is, as Megan described it as a love song to James Ellroy, is like it feels like an Ellroy novel. In fact, it feels like the best Ellroy novel that Ellroy has never written. First of all, there are parallels between Gene Spangler and Elizabeth Short, and it feels as well that Abbott is, making this her Black Dahlia novel, just as that was a huge novel for Ellroy. She's making this her novel of obsession. It's a novel of same themes of a kind of bad white guy, or not so much a bad guy, but obviously a guy who's coasting, a guy who's a little bit venal, a little bit self-absorbed. His chance, he's got to be, because that's the Hollywood culture, but it's his chance at redemption, and there's parallels there with Bucky Blycott. And also, Gil as a character could remind you of all those great Ellroy characters like Fred Otash, who of course was a real-life guy, Sid Hudgens, or Danny Getchell, from Hush Hush magazine. These incredibly, venal guys who we actually begin to like a lot because they're so dogged, and they're ruthless, and they're kind of relentless in their pursuit of the story or the copy or in this case just some sort of resolution. And of course it's every historical fiction novel based on a mystery is very, very difficult, because how do you resolve the mystery for the characters, so for Bucky Blycott or for Gil Hopkins, and yet it's not resolved for the public at large, because we still don't know what happened to Gene Spangler. And it's done, very, very skillfully and adroitly, and just really, really well. I've read the novel a few times. It always surprises me on one level. There's always something new, I take from it. Actually, Gene Spangler and Elizabeth Short, they have been linked together in actual terms. In fact, Steve Adell's Black Dahlia Avenger, which is a book I covered in an earlier episode of this show, that's where he posits that his father, the surgeon George Adell, was the murderer of Elizabeth Short. He also says that Adell more than likely killed Gene Spangler too. Now, reading Black Dahlia Avenger is probably a good idea, because it was quite an important book. It was a big book. And whether you think that's kind of tagged on, or whether you think it's plausible or implausible, it's up to you. But the Elizabeth Short was part of a bigger story in LA at the time, in which there were a lot of murders of young women that just weren't being solved, and there was a grand jury investigation as to why the LAPD were not solving these murders and these disappearances. So the novel Song As You, the Black Dahlia, Ellroy, they tap into this fear there was in late 1940s Los Angeles. Yes, it was a boom town. Yes, it was the golden years of Hollywood. All sorts going on. The massive expansion of the middle class, massive expansion into suburbia, urban sprawl. But that came at a cost, which was just this kind of underbelly of crime, vice, and fear that was going on. And yeah, I can't recommend this novel enough. The Song Is You is a wonderful novel. I mean, I actually prefer Megan Abbott's first four novels: Die a Little, Song As You, Queen Pin, Bury Me Deep. Those to me are just perfect masterpieces. And I continue to read her, but novels like The Fever and Dare Me, I felt like she was kind of going into a slightly Twin Peaks territory, which is fine. She's the master of her own career, and she's continued to gain new readers and get incredible, critical plaudits. But I didn't quite like those novels as much, to be honest. Especially it's because she abandoned the kind of classic vintage noir setting, and I hope one day she might go back to this territory a bit more. but you know, I feel like she some of her more recent novels have been more about her kind of Grosse Pointe upbringing, and you know, I've visited Grosse Pointe. It's like it's the Beverly Hills of Detroit. It's a pretty incredible place. Um, but it's probably got its own sort of underbelly. Everywhere does. Thank God we've got writers like Megan Abbott who can celebrate that. Okay, so not celebrate, but you know, unearth that in their writing. Okay, so the song is you is my recommendation for this week. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Ellroy Reads. Bye bye.